conclude here with a little Q&A panel discussion. I have a couple of questions for our distinguished guests here, and I'm going to open it up for questions to the audience if anyone has any burning questions. So maybe we can start with you, Don.
Sure.
Obviously your influence has been evident throughout the talks, and I've been curious about your thoughts. We have two sort of a dichotomy here. We have predictive methods, machine learning, AI, deep learning, and we have causal questions and causal discovery, but also estimating the effect of a cause. And how do you see these two worlds touching each other? This pushing econometrics to try and use machine learning for causal questions. Can you give us your perspective on that?
Well, my interpretation is that the machine learning, artificial intelligence world is more interested in sort of straightforward results, whereas I think that a lot of the stuff that I've been worrying about for years is more related to trying to get understanding. And this is something that actually David Cox and I have had several discussions about over the years. If you read his Planning of Experiments, which is a great book that was published in 1958, when he talks about design of experiments, it's not just the statistical design. There's a lot of wisdom in trying to get understanding of the real world. And of course, understanding something is something that develops in time. So you don't get understanding right away. Understanding means it's constantly changing. And so I think that's an important distinction that's even become more clear to me after listening to these presentations today, many of which I found fascinating, but they're really more focused on results or prediction, and understanding is sort of pushed aside, I think. And I think that and understanding really I think is more related to the phrase artificial intelligence, if you take it literally. Because understanding is like being intelligent, whereas artificial intelligence, as commonly used now, is just getting an answer, prediction.
So you think, paraphrasing you, machine learning is more interested in the one and done prediction task, whereas continuous learning or like lifelong learning is sort of where
much more complicated. And I'd be interested in hearing from the presenters whether they think that dichotomy or that description of what was presented today is fair to them.
Before we do that, let me interject one bit of opinion on that. And this has actually been a theme, I think, in a lot of talks today. But the only way in my mind that these things happen is we really have to collaborate with the people who are doing the science. I mean, just because I'm the only person I can really use as an example, I will use myself. When I became involved in the work I'm doing now on metagenomics, I had to build on a biology course that I took in the Stone Age. But the only way I could do it was, even if I had gotten a PhD in bioinformatics 20 or 10 years ago,
irrelevant.
Couldn't have done it without working at first hand with the problem owners and the people who understand the science. So I don't think, in the scientific sense, that there are very many important or challenging problems, and people should feel free to yell at me about this, but I don't think there are important problems that one person can approach by sitting in his or her office. It takes teams of people because the world is just too complex and too complicated.
So, but how do we move away? So what's a good solution or a good mechanism to step forward? Not so much about the collaboration, which I think we just do it one collaboration.
In my case, it's very simple. I'm just not afraid of making an idiot of myself when I begin collaborating with people.
But I mean, to the one and done sort of mentality, because at some level, a lot of the scientists are federally funded, or they're working on a consulting project, they're working on a collaboration, let's say, with people in industry, and there is a focus or, the need for having some focus on metrics and performance metrics, right? And so how do we add some, what would you consider adding to, for the collaborations to move beyond this sort of one and done mentality, or, because eventually people have to be motivated, they have to have some incentive to move where you guys are saying they should move toward.
I think I agree with what you're saying, but I think that many people, especially when they collaborate, are really interested in ideas and developing understanding from different perspectives. I think one of the great things about collaboration is that, especially if you're collaborating with people who are bright, you argue a lot. And so I think there's nothing wrong with disagreement. And in fact, I think probably maybe all of the good stuff that I've done has been with collaborators, or at least inspired by collaborators who come from a different perspective. Sometimes it's medicine, sometimes it's economics, but I think it's terribly important to work with collaborators for that challenge of communicating with each other and across disciplines.
Let's change gears a little bit. I have a couple more questions. But
sure.
So what about standards? As the models get more complicated, the mechanism get more complicated. We've seen a couple of great examples from Russ. We've seen an example from June now, taking, a creative approach in leveraging some AI tools for classical statistical problems, and, we do a lot better. So how do we evaluate, how do we fully evaluate these very complicated models other than, showing anecdotes?
Well, my first reaction is it requires understanding. So for probably about at least half the talk today, I sort of understood at a very superficial level what's going on. I mean, I can understand the mechanics of what people are describing, but understanding why they worked is sort of I think a much deeper issue. Because if you understand why something works, that means you can embed that technique in a larger class of methods. And I think to me, there was too much focus on the particular technique being presented and giving it some name. And you say, I see, it works better than some other method based on some simulation. And in my mind also, I was constantly mentally asking, so what was the simulation relevant? So was the simulation described as an experiment, because that's what they are, they're experiments, and what are the factors in that experiment? And what are the levels of factors that were chosen? And why are they relevant? And if I'm going to get something from this simulation experiment about understanding, I'm basically embedding that experiment in a whole class of possible experiments that I did. Not because there's a population of experiments in it, not talking about Fisher versus Neyman or something, but just when you do a simulation experiments, you're trying to get understanding. And I found some of and it's probably unfair, but I found some of the presentations, at least, too buried in the details of what was done and not summarized by saying what I learned in this understanding sense.
To be fair to the presenter, I guess, we also gave them very little time to say it all. But yes, I mean, oftentimes even in written papers that are 40, 50 pages long, there's just this one simulated example as opposed to design the simulation as if it was an experiment,
right.
which
it is.
Which it is, yes. And so, Alan.
Well, let me just add
please.
one thing to that before you go on to the next question. And it's just a slightly different take. That one visual that I showed for 2 seconds and then pulled down because I didn't have time to do it.
I remember that one. It looked interesting, and it's gone.
Had to do with generating synthetic coronavirus genomes. And it actually had multiple different ways. And there the problem is not necessarily, as it would be in official statistics, where the role of synthetic data is to try to be as close as possible, so to speak, to original data, but typically with more privacy protection. We would like to have synthetic data that are not out to lunch, but also more diverse than original data set because there's a potential for being able to use broader sets of synthetic data, for instance, for training network models. But the point I was trying to get to there is I don't think many of us have been as careful as we could be and should be about probing the boundaries of what we've done, and that's another reason why I'd like to generate synthetic data that don't necessarily look like the original data, because I'd like to know when certain pieces of a bioinformatics software pipeline don't work. So, this is sort of, almost going back to, sort of history of science 101 or something. Why isn't the first thing we try to do to break what we've done, rather than to, find another, situation where it might work?
Yes, that's a refreshing perspective. I find oftentimes when working with a collaborator who's a practitioner, we spend maybe 2 months coming up with a solution to the problem, and it's great, and then we spend 12 more months trying to destroy, to make it fail, to see whether it's actually robust, to give answers that we can believe in and rely on.
All practical methods have boundaries, and I don't think one really understands whether a method is good without understanding when it breaks. So I think that's part of the investigation, which leads to understanding.
Yeah, I agree. And Alan had a transportation example, and I always think when people talk about self-driving cars, like yes, you're gonna train your car on the United States highways. You're gonna drop the same model in Cairo. Let's see what happens there. It's like, that's a boundary problem, I guess, right? Okay, so I do have many more questions, but I think it would be fair to open it up to the audience at this point, and you don't want to monopolize all of your time. And I wonder if there's a microphone, I guess. Thank you, Robert. Anyone has questions, please raise your hand, and the microphone will be taken to you.
Question probably is, where's the reception?
That I think we'll answer at the end.
Hi, professors. My name is Wei-Jing Lei with a Temple Master's degree in Business Analytics. My question is that, is there a balance between privacy and building a really good AI models?
I'll start off with that, and then give Don a chance to disagree with me. I don't think, I think there needs to be kind of a dual interpretation of privacy relating to both how the models are developed and then how the models are employed. There's no doubt, say if you walk down the street in most American cities, there are closed-circuit cameras, and those may be used to perform facial recognition. Whether that's an invasion of your privacy that's why I had a bunch of question marks next to privacy in my talk. It's not clear. I hear in airports people screaming into their cell phones about things that, as far as I can tell, are their private lives. So, whether there are generational issues there. I have actually worked on data privacy for more than 25 years, and all I can say is it's evolving, and it's just not clear where it's going.
I too have worked on privacy for years. I think probably one of the first things I did was with Internal Revenue Service, maybe 40 years ago, and using their data. And that's where I came up with this idea of trying to create artificial data that looked like the real data up to a certain level of interaction. But all the data was, in this perspective, all the data that you release is fake. And the first thing you tell the users is, here's a fake data set, but the data set, and if you try to look too deeply at details, you won't get anything. It's all noise. But at a certain level of marginal effects or interaction effects, you'll get a valid inference in the usual sort of confidence interval sense of valid inference, but not for anything deeper meaning more detailed. And with that announcement, I think there's very little motivation for a data snooper to try to snoop for an interaction, which he knows is phony, just made up, just random noise. So those are just one of the vague ideas I have. I think is relevant to try to deal with the issue that when you're releasing real data, you have to worry about who you're releasing it to whom you're releasing it. You know,
So let me just add two things to that, and then we can move on to the next question. One is that privacy is inherently linked to what an agency or another data collector promises, and you can't disconnect it from the consent process. The other is, I think historically, and this I think echoes what Don said, I think historically the federal agencies have been over conservative about trying to reduce what they saw as risk at the expense of the utility of the data. And I don't really care at this point if somebody knows what my salary is, and you know, so much information, but really coming to what Don was saying, I mean, we have been, what has really held us, sort of the privacy research community back, I think, is we make totally unrealistic assumptions about the motivation and the resources, whether they're financial or computational or whatever, of data snoopers. I mean, as far as I can tell, the fact that Don could break a database shouldn't be interesting to anybody because he's an expert.
I have no idea how to do it. That's the big limitation.
But I mean, why is anybody wanting to do it at this point, since everything else is out there for purchase anyway?
I have the same attitude, but I don't. But it's personal.
Actually, I do want to raise one additional point, because this echoes a couple of things, but I think it's something that's really important to us that to some ways we've lost track of, and that's data quality. Yeah. Right now we've got machines spewing out terabytes or more of data. When data points were hard to come by, people cared about their quality because you had to care about their quality. What really got me into some of the stuff I've been doing in the metagenomics is there are these public genome sequence databases are rife with data quality problems, and there's nobody sort of curating them or even attempting to identify potential data quality problems. So I think no matter what the source is, that there are problems. So if there are any students still in the audience and you're looking for something that's a really interesting problem, data quality is our Achilles heel.
Yeah, and Natesh spoke to that during his
yes,
talk.
Exactly.
I guess I have, let's go on with the audience's question. Please.
Hey guys, would the data quality kill my digital twin?
Say it again, please.
Would the data quality issue kill my digital twin?
I'm not sure. Could you elaborate on that question, please?
So earlier you're talking about GE has digital twins of the engines. And theoretical hypothesis is that all the bioinformation that Apple is now retaining from all of our watches will be able to create a digital twin of us. So what if the data quality stuff?
So I think anything like digital twins or any form of synthetic data is subject to data quality issues, but I don't think they're irresolvable issues. I think people just need to look more carefully at the potential sources of error, and I don't want to say that error is the only thing that could be wrong with data, because there can also be a lot of other things. But I don't view data quality as a game breaker. What I do think, though, is that we, scientific enterprise generically, whether I mean federal agencies or corporations or whatever, has got to understand that there needs to be more investment in data quality.
I get that. It brings up an interesting point in a project I was involved in maybe 30, 40 years ago with National Center for Health Statistics, I think. And the issue is we wanted to do a simulation experiment, and there were two versions of a database or a subset of the database, I guess, that we could use. And one was the data as collected, which is going to be the purpose of the study, to try to see how to improve the data collection process. And the other data set was the same data set, except with errors corrected. So there were clerks who corrected the errors. And most of the people on this committee wanted to use the better data set, means the one with the errors corrected. But in fact, because the purpose of the study was to try to do a simulation study, we could take subsamples of the real data that emulated what was going to happen in the future. I argued, and I finally convinced the people, no, you should use the flawed data, because that's what you're going to be dealing with in the future. So the flawed data set can be better for some purposes than the corrected data. And after doing a little simulation study, it was pretty easy to convince the people who thought otherwise.
Yes, for instance, the flawed data set could be better for understanding.
Yeah,
right?
that's right. Exactly.
Exactly right. There. Coming.
So I certainly appreciate your remarks, Don, about understanding and criticism leveled at Bart and whatever in terms of not really giving so much understanding. Fair enough. But in a way, understanding is in the eye of the beholder, right? I mean, what does it mean for us really to understand something? We sometimes strive for simplicity. It's because we can tell a story. But it's just kind of, it's a vague idea. It's certainly appealing. I like to understand. I like to sort of have a feeling I know kind of what's going on, but it's kind of, I know it when I see it.
Sort of like porn.
Thank you for that elaboration.
You can tell your joke now. No, I completely agree with that, because it's in the understanding means you know, at least on the edges, of how to generalize to situations beyond those that are described by the data that you have. I think that's what understanding means in this context. And I think that depends a lot on what problem you want to solve. So I think understanding in that sense has to depend upon the context in which you're working. But I think it's got to be the goal, too.
Expansion of what I just said. So I actually concur with you about the hatred of this name of artificial intelligence. As actually when I asked some of the experts in AI, well-known figure like Michael Jordan, he actually claimed artificial intelligence doesn't really exist so far. It's just a bunch of algorithms. So actually that made me think, so how do you really define intelligence or artificial intelligence? If you can't really define what it is, you can't claim it doesn't or does exist. We sort of vaguely know what intelligence is, but mathematically, I don't think I know the definition.
Well, I guess what Marvin Minsky made up the term, didn't he? The guy from MIT, computer scientist, whatever his name is. And when I was in graduate school at Harvard, being in Cambridge area was a fabulous place to be because when I was at Harvard as a graduate student, I was floated through 3 different graduate school departments. And I actually took but sat in some classes at MIT. And there's no doubt that was a terribly exciting area to be in. Geographical area, because there were guys like Chomsky, giving talks, and Minsky, as well as the guys at Harvard. And I was interested in psychology. I was interested in applied math and computing science. So it was a great area to be in. I think the interaction of all those fields was also terribly stimulating. And I think it probably still is for students to float between areas.
That time, remember, artificial intelligence, it was really hot. It was a really big, like a fad. And then it kind of died out. And everyone, and now it's sort of being resurrected again in this as, more technology improves and stuff like that. So I...
One thing that I want to say about that is, even when it's used now, and even when it was used back then, you're not trying to figure out intelligence in the same way as a person thinks. I don't think there's any hope of that, at least for thousands of years. Because the way a person thinks is, given a problem that doesn't have an elegant or simple solution, one of the things that humans do is they say, well, they don't say this out loud, but the way their thinking goes is, I can't solve that problem. But here's a problem that I can solve in a relatively elegant way that's close. So how do you define close? I have no idea. But I think that's the way people think. Here's a problem. It's too hard or something like that. And because the real world is far too complicated for anything but approximations. I mean, that quote not only goes back to Box, but von Neumann said that, I think, in the early 50s, maybe. And it wasn't because he couldn't do the math. Because if von Neumann couldn't do the math, nobody could do the math. So he was just describing, the state of nature. Everything's an approximation. And as you learn more, you get better approximations. And so I think that comes to the desire to understand, because that's where these approximations come from. Some simpler model that you can solve.
So an interesting speculation is that if public perception of AI sinks sufficiently low, are we going to develop a new name for what we're doing?
That's fair.
So you had on your slide 2 different things. There was interpretable AI and explainable AI. And I was thinking, those are both about understanding, I suppose, but what's the difference?
Well, they're both about the relationship between the real world, if I were to put it that way, but specifically about people and the tools, and whether I don't know the details of what's happened in the European Union, but my understanding is there is a nascent regulation of some sort that says if you can't explain it in court, you can't be using it to make decisions that affect people's futures.
Good old Europe.
So whether that's interpretable or no, but so I think I would look at that and say, very well intentioned, but there's no way anybody could ever implement a regulation like that because it's so vague and it requires specification of things that can't be specified. But on the other hand, it does remind us that there are the human effects of some of these things, and there is potential for malpractice.
What I would say to that is, we do need some sort of standard eventually, and I would say maybe standard for model evaluation. So, if some AI tool or some complicated model needs to be used for human decisions, well, at least I would like to see an evaluation of that model on the whole parametric space rather than on a subset of parameter on a subset of the space.
I think what's missing at this point is the contextualization. I think, to use an example that I mentioned, they're going to have to be standards for autonomous vehicles because you can't have every manufacturer with their own system. Among other things, these have to communicate with each other. Right. So, and some places in the medical world, from FDA is going to be regulating what's, already regulates the software in medical devices, and if there are things we call AI, the FDA is going to be regulating them. But they're doing it in a very narrowly and scientifically specified context. So that's where I think the EU is sort of missing the point, that it's just at much too high a level of generality.
All right, I guess we're running out of time here, so I would like to thank our distinguished guests again.
Thank you.